She was seconds away from saying yes, surrounded by luxury, promises, and a seemingly perfect future, until a single voice pierced through the wall and destroyed everything. Between hidden whispers and words that should never have been heard, the truth emerged at the worst possible moment. What seemed like bridal jitters was, in fact, the omen of a calculated and cold betrayal. And when love revealed itself to be a cruel strategy, she decided she would not leave that place as a victim. Before discovering how everything collapsed in front of hundreds of witnesses, prepare yourself for a story that will leave you breathless. The Cavalcante group had survived 3 generations of storms, economic crises, land disputes, prolonged droughts, and the relentless passage of time. Founded by Isabella's grandfather in the countryside of Mato Grosso, the conglomerate grew to become one of the largest agribusiness and food processing groups in Brazil, with headquarters in São Paulo and branches spread across 5 states. It was a name that evoked respect in financial market circles, political halls, and the corridors of international commodity fairs. And it was also the name that Isabella Cavalcante had carried since she first opened her eyes to the world. She was 32 years old, with shoulder-length dark hair and brown eyes that carried an intelligence many underestimated behind her polite smile. A graduate in administration with a specialization in business management from FGV, she was the director of strategic development for the group, a position her father, Helio Cavalcante, had created especially for her after realizing that none of the old directors saw the future with the clarity his daughter demonstrated. Isabella had not just inherited the surname, she had inherited the instinct. But on that October morning, enclosed in the preparation room of the Palacio dos Sonhos, the most sophisticated event space in Goiânia, chosen for being the city where the group had taken its first steps, the instinct was quiet. In its place was a soft, scented mist made of tulle and hope, which rested upon every thought, like the train of the dress that the seamstress adjusted with skillful fingers. "Perfect," murmured Donna Clea, the seamstress who had crafted the dress over the course of 8 months. "You are stunning, Isabella." Isabella observed her reflection in the full-length mirror. The dress was ivory white with hand embroidery on the sleeves and a discreet neckline that highlighted her shoulders. She recognized the beauty, but there was something she couldn't name, a small, almost imperceptible sting that insisted on appearing between one sigh and another. "Thank you, Clea," she said, and the smile was genuine, though incomplete. Outside, the main hall was buzzing. 350 guests waited. Businessmen, politicians, international partners of the group, family and close friends. The list had been curated with the same rigor applied to a corporate merger. Each name had a weight, a relationship, an expectation. It wasn't just a wedding. It was, as Isabella's father had said at a private dinner weeks before, the most important alliance in the history of the group. Eduardo Meireles was 36 years old, a partner at an investment boutique based in São Paulo, and had entered Isabella's life 18 months earlier at an agribusiness conference in Brasília. Tall, with a calm voice and a precise smile, he knew from the first meeting how to behave in front of her. He didn't treat her as an heiress, he treated her as a professional, and that, for Isabella, had been the greatest surprise. The courtship evolved with a naturalness that she attributed to the maturity of both. There were no dramas, no excessive insecurities. Eduardo was present, articulate, and showed genuine interest in the group and in Isabella's strategic vision, an interest she interpreted as intellectual admiration. Helio Cavalcante had approved of his son-in-law with reserved enthusiasm, as was his style. "He is a serious man," he had said once, and from Helio's mouth, that was equivalent to a maximum compliment. The engagement happened in Florianopolis at a seaside dinner. The ring was a classic piece with a central diamond that Eduardo described, smiling, as timeless, just like you. Isabella had laughed, accepted, and that night she slept with a lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. Now in the preparation room, Clea was finishing the last adjustments, while Fernanda, Isabella's childhood friend and maid of honor, touched up her lipstick in front of the smaller mirror. Fernanda was the opposite of Isabella in temperament, expansive, direct, with a sense of humor that cut through the silence in any environment. But beneath the vivacity, There was an unwavering loyalty that Isabella had known since she was 6 years old. "You are too quiet for a bride," Fernanda said, without taking her eyes off the mirror. "I'm fine," Isabella replied. "Fine is exactly what people say when they are not fine." Isabella opened her mouth to respond, but the event coordinator entered with a tablet in hand, announcing last-minute adjustments to the order of the wedding party's entrance. The conversation died there, replaced by the logistics that the final minutes always brought. There were 40 minutes left until the ceremony, when Isabella asked for a moment alone. Clea left. Fernanda obeyed with a look that said she would be back soon. The coordinator closed the door carefully, and Isabella stood before the mirror, taking a deep breath, trying to identify what was out of place. It wasn't fear. She had already examined that possibility. It wasn't regret. Eduardo was attentive, intelligent, compatible. It wasn't family pressure. She was used to dealing with expectations since forever. It was something else. A low and persistent frequency, like the hum of an appliance that no one heard turn on. She decided to walk, not to the hall, just through the internal corridor, the stretch that connected the preparation suites to the backstage of the event. A 50-meter path, just to breathe air different from the dense perfume of flowers that filled the room. The corridor was made of beige marble, with recessed lighting that created a golden and discreet glow. She walked slowly, lightly holding the skirt of her dress with one hand. In the background, she heard voices. It wasn't uncommon. The structure of the palace had a peculiar acoustic. Sounds traveled unpredictably through ventilation pipes and double walls. But there was something in that voice that made her stop even before consciously processing what she was hearing. It was Eduardo's voice. She couldn't distinguish every word yet, only the tone, low, intimate, with a familiarity that didn't correspond to any professional conversation. Isabella stood still in the middle of the corridor, her heart slowing down while her senses sharpened. The voice continued, and then came a short, soft laugh, definitely feminine, coming from another phone on the other side of the call. Isabella took 3 steps toward the source of the sound. A door slightly ajar, 2 meters in front of her, allowed the words to escape with enough clarity for her to hear. Without any ambiguity, Eduardo say, "A few more months, my love. That's all that's left." The world didn't shake. The chandelier didn't swing. The soft music coming from the hall didn't stop. But something inside Isabella, silently, broke in half. She stood motionless. Her feet seemed glued to the cold marble, the dress suddenly weighing as if every embroidery had absorbed lead. Eduardo's voice continued coming through the crack in the door, controlled, affectionate, using a tone she recognized all too well. It was the same one he used with her on Sunday mornings, when the phone was set aside and time seemed to belong only to the two of them. That tone was hers. It had been hers, or at least she had believed so. "You can trust me. I've always known what I was doing," Eduardo said from the other side of the door. She backed away 2 steps slowly without making a sound. The heel of her satin shoe made an almost imperceptible sound on the marble, but it was enough for her to hold her breath. Eduardo showed no sign that he had heard anything. He was completely absorbed in the call, confident in the privacy of that side corridor that few knew about. Isabella returned to the preparation room with controlled steps, closed the door behind her carefully, and stood still in the center of the room, surrounded by the scent of white flowers, by the impeccable dress reflected in the mirror, by the still fresh echo of the words she had heard. When Fernanda came back in, she found Isabella sitting in the armchair next to the vanity, her eyes fixed on nothing, the bouquet of white orchids resting on her lap like an object she had forgotten to put down. "Bella?" Fernanda's voice immediately lost its relaxed tone. She closed the door, walked to her friend and knelt in front of her. "What happened?" Isabella took a moment. When she spoke, her voice came out firm, not because she was fine, but because there was something inside her that refused to collapse before completely understanding what she had found in that corridor. "I need you to help me," she said, "and I need you not to ask any questions that I can't answer yet." Fernanda looked at her for 3 seconds. Then she nodded, without blinking. "I'm here. What do you need?" Fernanda was one of those people born with an internal radar for when someone needed space and when they needed presence. Over 26 years of friendship, Isabella had seen this skill work countless times, with family members in crisis, with co-workers on the brink of collapse, with herself on the most difficult nights of her life. But she had never been as grateful for that ability as at that moment, when Fernanda simply nodded, without pressing, without demanding explanations that Isabella still didn't know how to formulate. "I need you to find out who Eduardo is talking to right now," Isabella said, her voice low and completely flat. "He is in the side corridor, to the right of the preparation suites. There is a door slightly ajar. He is on the phone." Fernanda stood up, straightened her bridesmaid dress with a minimal gesture, and left the room without asking questions. Isabella stood in the center of the room, breathing with the forced regularity of someone who had learned to contain the internal tide before deciding anything. There was a discipline in that. She had developed this capacity over the years, working alongside her father in crisis meetings, in contract renegotiations, in situations where showing instability was the same as losing ground. The Cavalcante group had not reached where it was with decisions made under emotion, and Isabella, even at that moment, even with her heart beating out of its usual rhythm, knew she needed to think before acting. What she had heard was fragmented, a phrase, a tone, a voice on the other side that sounded feminine. It wasn't enough for conclusions. It was, however, more than enough to trigger an alert. Fernanda returned in 7 minutes. She closed the door, leaned against it, and looked at Isabella with an expression that said everything before any word. "He had already finished the call when I arrived," Fernanda said. "But I saw him leaving the corridor. He was putting his cell phone away and had that face men have when they finish a conversation they shouldn't be having. You know that face. I've been married and divorced twice, Bella. I know that face better than any other." Fernanda crossed her arms. "What did you hear?" Isabella told her. Word for word, with the precision of someone who had repeated the phrase internally several times since returning to the room. Fernanda listened without interrupting, her face becoming progressively more serious. "A few more months, my love. Few. That's what I heard. It could have context." "It could," Isabella agreed, "and that's why I haven't done anything yet." Fernanda was silent for a moment. Then, "What do you want to do?" Isabella looked at the mirror. She faced the reflection of the dress, the embroidery, the ring on her left finger that she had put on for the first time 18 months ago, with the feeling that something good and solid had arrived to stay. She had no tears. She had something colder and more useful than tears. She had focus. "I want to understand what is happening before I do anything," she said. "And I want to do it without him realizing that I know anything." "So you're going to get married?" "I don't know yet." Isabella turned to Fernanda. "But I know I'm not going to act in the dark. If there is something wrong, I need to know exactly what. And I need proof." Fernanda nodded slowly. "How much time do we have?" 32 minutes until the ceremony. Then let's use every second." The plan took shape in the following minutes, with a speed that surprised even Isabella. Fernanda would use the pretext of checking the organization of the procession to circulate backstage and observe Eduardo's interactions with the guests. Isabella, in turn, would send a message to her father asking him to come to the preparation room for a trivial reason. She wanted his advice. She needed his calm perspective before taking any step. Helio Cavalcante arrived in 4 minutes, as he always did when his daughter called. He was 71 years old, with white hair he never wanted to dye, and the same brown eyes as Isabella, eyes that had seen decades of negotiations, agricultural cycles, bets that paid off and others that cost dearly. He entered the room, looked at his daughter a fraction of a second longer than usual, and said, "You are not well." It wasn't a question. "Father," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear everything before reacting." Helio walked to the armchair, sat down with his usual upright posture, crossed his hands over his knee and said, "I'm listening," Isabella told him. This time more carefully than she had told Fernanda, because with her father there was an extra layer, the layer of the group, of interests that went beyond the personal. of what that phrase could or could not mean in the larger context of everything that had been built by 3 generations. When she finished, Helio was silent for a long time. The muffled noise of the music and the voices from the hall came through the wall like a distant whisper. Then he said, without variation in tone, "You did well to call me. What do you think it means?" "I don't know yet, but I know that a phrase like that in this context should not exist." He looked at her. "And you are right not to act without understanding. I have less than 30 minutes. Then let's work fast." Helio stood up, and there was in that gesture the same determination Isabella had seen in emergency meetings when the group needed to make decisions under adverse conditions. "Is there someone trustworthy who can check Eduardo's recent movements? Something financial, something contractual?" "Rodrigo," Isabella said immediately. Rodrigo Sampaio was the group's legal director, had worked alongside Helio for 19 years, and was one of the few people who knew every clause, every corporate structure, every legal vulnerability of the Cavalcante group. "Call him now," Helio said, discreetly. Isabella already had her cell phone in hand when Helio said one last thing, with a low and direct voice as he always did in the hours that mattered. "Whatever the result of what Rodrigo discovers, the final decision is yours. It is your life that is at the center of this, and I trust your judgment." She nodded once, and in that simple gesture there was a weight she recognized, the weight of being the heiress of a multi-billion-dollar group, and at the same time a woman who had genuinely believed in someone and was starting to suspect that this belief had been the gap exploited against her. Helio stood by the window while she dialed. From the outside garden came the contained murmur of the guests who were still circulating outdoors before being called to the hall. 350 people who did not know that, in that preparation room scented with orchids, something much larger than a wedding was being decided. Rodrigo answered on the second ring, which was typical of him. Isabella spoke low and directly without circumlocution. "Rodrigo, I need you to check something now. Any document that Eduardo Mireles or his investment boutique has presented to the group in the last 6 months, proposals, memorandums, anything related to corporate structure or rights over assets." There was a brief pause on the other side. "Isabella, the ceremony starts in—" "I know when it starts, that's why I'm calling now." Another short pause. Then, with the tone of someone who had worked long enough with the Cavalcantes to recognize when something serious was at stake. "I'll check. Where am I meeting you?" "In the main preparation room. 10 minutes. She hung up. In the mirror in front of her, the dress still shone under the golden light, as if the day were exactly what it seemed to be. But Isabella no longer saw the dress. She saw the corridor, the door slightly ajar, Eduardo's voice, and the ever-narrowing gap between what she had believed and what she was starting to suspect. Rodrigo Sampaio entered the preparation room with the contained step of someone who had learned, over 19 years of working alongside Helio Cavalcante, that calmness was not the absence of urgency. It was the only functional path within it. He was a 54-year-old man, thin with thin-rimmed glasses and a dark leather briefcase that he rarely let go of. He closed the door carefully, saw Helio standing by the window, Fernanda leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, and Isabella standing in the center of the room with the posture of someone who had decided she would not sit until she had answers. "I found something," he said simply. The silence that settled in was the kind that occupies physical space. Isabella crossed her arms and waited. And Rodrigo opened the briefcase, took out 2 printed sheets and placed them on the vanity, next to the bouquet of orchids that no one had moved. 6 weeks ago, Eduardo presented our legal department with a proposal to revise the prenuptial agreement. The original proposal provided for total separation of assets with an integral protection clause for the Cavalcante Group's assets. He pointed to the second sheet. The new proposal revised that clause in a subtle but legally relevant way. It created a window of participation over specific group assets in case of marital dissolution after 24 months of marriage. Isabella did not move. "Who approved this revision?" "No one yet. It is under analysis in the contracts department. I myself had not become aware of it because the filing was made by an external assistant of Eduardo's, without passing through my approval. 24 months, Helio repeated, his voice low as it always was when he was processing something grave. Exactly. Enough time to establish solid legal ties, and in a judicial dissolution this window could be used to claim participation in the processing units in Mato Grosso and Bahia, the two divisions in the greatest process of appreciation since last year's expansion. Isabella turned slowly to the mirror. The dress was still there, impeccable, as if the world around it were not reconfiguring itself in silence. She looked at the reflection of herself for a few seconds before speaking. So it's a long-term plan? It seems so, Rodrigo said, but we still need more to state it with certainty. Fernanda, who had heard everything in silence, took a step forward. I saw Eduardo talking to someone in the hall, a man who was not on the guest list, grey hair, dark blue suit. Rodrigo frowned slightly. Antonio Freires. Do you know him? Helio asked. If it's him, yes. Antonio Freires is a corporate lawyer, specialty in hostile mergers and acquisitions, dissolution of family structures, and inheritance litigation. He works with clients who prefer not to appear publicly. The weight of those words landed on the room like a stone on still water, slowly, but with reverberation that reached the edges. If Eduardo brought him here today, Isabella said, then it's not just a proposal for legal revision. It's someone monitoring the process, or confirming that the plan is at the right point to move forward, Helio completed. There was a quality in her father's voice that Isabella recognized well. It wasn't anger. It was the cold determination of someone who spent decades learning that impulsive reactions cost more than the problem that generated them. I need to talk to him, she said. To Eduardo? Yes. Before the ceremony, Fernanda took a step forward. Bella, if you confront him now without enough proof, he can deny everything, and you'll be left with no way out in the middle of the event. I know. That's why I'm not going to confront him. I'm going to observe. She looked at Fernanda. Does your cell phone record audio with quality good enough to be used as a reference? Fernanda understood even before the question finished. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket and unlocked it. The microphone is professional. I bought it specifically because my niece has a band. Then I'm going to need it. Helio observed his daughter with that look that wasn't a prohibition. It was an evaluation. Go carefully. Don't risk what you don't yet have. Isabella took Fernanda's cell phone, adjusted the recorder settings, and placed it in the small handbag that matched the dress, the only piece she had insisted on carrying, despite the coordinator having considered it unusual for a bride. Now she knew why she had insisted. She looked at herself one last time in the mirror, straightened her shoulders, and went toward the door. The outer corridor led to the main foyer of the Palacio dos Sonhos, a wide, high-ceilinged anteroom with crystal chandeliers and mother-of-pearl panels on the walls. Event coordinators were making last adjustments before opening the doors to the hall. No one looked at Isabella with strangeness. It was natural for the bride to circulate in the final minutes. She found Eduardo exactly where the coordinator had said the bride and groom would position themselves before the procession. He was facing away, talking to one of the groomsmen, a light conversation, the kind one has when everything seems under control. When he heard her steps, he turned and smiled. It was a beautiful smile. Isabella recognized that now with a specific lucidity, the pain of someone who realizes that beauty and intention are completely separate things. You are stunning, he said. I wanted a few minutes with you, she replied, with a smile that cost less effort than she expected. Before going in, Eduardo dismissed the groomsman with a cordial gesture. Of course. He took her hand between his. Nervous? A little. It was true, just not for the reason he supposed. Eduardo, she said, choosing her tone with the care of a surgeon, have you thought about what the first year after the wedding will be like? From a professional point of view? He blinked slightly, a micro-expression that lasted less than a second but that she captured. You want to talk business 15 minutes before going to the altar. Not business, plans, the future. She kept the smile. I've always been like this. I know, and it's one of the things I admire most about you. He paused, his gaze briefly going to some point beyond her shoulder. The projects I mentioned are on the right track. Some depend on conditions that are still consolidating, but the projection is good. Conditions like the wedding? A micro pause. Smaller this time, more controlled. The wedding changes a lot of things. Credibility, stability. You know how it works. I know, she said. And inside the bag, Fernanda's recorder registered every word. The event coordinator appeared with a tablet, announcing that the hall was ready to begin the ceremony. Eduardo looked at Isabella with a full smile, absolutely convinced that the day was running as planned. Ready? He asked. Isabella looked at him for a moment. The exact time she needed to register everything. The smile, the outstretched hand, the eyes that did not know what she knew. Then she said, with the same serenity as always, "Ready." And when she placed her hand in his and walked toward the hall, she was no longer just the bride entering. She was someone who had made a decision and who needed a few more pieces before acting. The hall opened before them like a parallel world. Flowers, light, 350 pairs of eyes turned to the bride, who walked elegantly down the center aisle. No one there could imagine what she carried in her bag, nor what had been decided in the room scented with orchids, while the music waited. The main hall of the Palacio dos Sonhos had been transformed into something bordering on the dreamlike. Arrangements of white and gold flowers rose in columns along the central aisle, every detail thought out to create an atmosphere that combined grandeur with restrained elegance, the same balance that the Cavalcantes prized in everything they did. The live music was soft. The candles in crystal candelabras projected warm light onto the attentive faces of 350 guests who stood up upon seeing Isabella enter. She walked with her usual posture, shoulders open, firm step, a smile on her face that no one there could distinguish from a genuine one, because she had learned from an early age that there are moments when the difference between strength and the appearance of strength has no practical importance. What mattered was what was inside the bag. What mattered was what still needed to happen. Eduardo waited for her beside the officiant, a man of advanced age and a deep voice who had conducted Cavalcante ceremonies for 2 decades. Upon seeing Isabella advance down the aisle, Eduardo flashed a smile that she recognized as genuinely satisfied, and she realized, with a clarity that cut deep, that that satisfaction was not just effective. It was strategic. It was the smile of someone who sees a piece click into place. She reached him. She took the hand he extended. And while the officiant began the opening speech, Isabella kept her eyes forward and her thoughts in motion. What she had so far, a phrase overheard in a corridor, a suspicious legal document, a lawyer specialized in corporate disputes present without an invitation, and a recording of Eduardo acknowledging that conditions were consolidating for his projects whose resolution deadline coincided exactly with the window that the proposal to revise the prenuptial agreement created. What she didn't have yet, explicit confirmation that there was another woman, that the relationship had been built as a strategy from the start, and that the plan was exactly what she suspected, and not, by some improbable chance, a series of coincidences. She needed more. The officiant spoke about the importance of commitment, about the choice to build a life alongside another person. The words reached Isabella like sound filtered through glass, present, but without real weight. She observed the hall with the peripheral attention of someone trained to process multiple pieces of information at the same time. And then she found what she was looking for. On the column to the right, discreetly leaning exactly where Fernanda had described, was a man with grey hair and a dark blue suit. Antonio Freires, if Rodrigo's identification was correct, was not looking at the officiant. He was looking at Eduardo, with the calm and calculated expression of someone monitoring a process he knows by heart. For an instant, Eduardo slightly turned his head, not enough to be noticed by anyone not paying attention, and his eyes and Freires met. 1 second, only 1 second. But it was enough for Isabella to understand that those 2 men had planned to be in that hall together, on that day. observing the same event from complementary angles. The officiant reached the point where he asked the couple to look at each other. Eduardo turned to her with that focused attention she had interpreted so many times as full presence. Isabella looked back at him, and for the first time in 18 months, she looked without the filter of belief. What she saw was a competent man, intelligent, capable of maintaining a performance long enough for it to seem like reality. But also, now that she knew where to look, a man who had made a mistake. He had underestimated who she was. He had treated the heiress of the Cavalcante group as someone who could be moved by affection without noticing what was being done around her. That was the error, and it was irreversible. The officiant made a natural pause in the ceremony, the moment when vows would be exchanged, and Isabella felt her heart accelerate, not from emotion but from clarity. She had rehearsed the vows. She had chosen every word carefully for weeks, but the text she had prepared was not what needed to be said now. Eduardo began to speak. His voice was firm, modulated, carrying exactly the appropriate emotional weight for the occasion. He looked at her as he spoke of commitment, of partnership, of choice, and Isabella heard every word with the attention of someone who is documenting, not feeling. When he finished, the officiant turned to her. The hall went silent. Isabella took a deep breath. She opened the bag with a minimal gesture, took out Fernanda's cell phone, and held it in her hand, with the screen facing down. Eduardo looked at the device with an expression that lasted less than a second. Controlled surprise, immediate uncertainty. She saw the micro-expression and registered it. "I also have something to say," she said, and her voice came out firm, clear, audible in every corner of the hall. "But first, I want to share something with everyone who is here." The murmur began immediately among the guests, low, contained, the kind of whisper that runs through a closed room when something escapes the expected protocol. Eduardo maintained his expression, but she saw the tension in his shoulders increase by a millimeter. "Isabella," he said, in a tone that wanted to sound affectionate and sounded like a warning. She didn't answer. She pressed the play icon on the cell phone and raised it slightly. Eduardo's voice emerged from the speaker, clear, familiar, saying the words he had said in that foyer minutes before the ceremony. "The projects I mentioned are on the right track. Some depend on conditions that are still consolidating." And then, in response to her question, "The wedding changes a lot of things, credibility, stability." The silence that settled afterward was different from all previous silences. It was the silence of 350 people simultaneously processing something they didn't expect to hear, and that they didn't yet know how to interpret, but that they felt, with the precision that unexpected situations sometimes carry, that there was more to come. Isabella lowered the phone. She looked at Eduardo, and she said, with the same calmness with which she conducted presentations for international investors, "Now I'll tell the rest. I'll tell." Eduardo opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For someone who had built an entire career on the ability to respond with fluidity in any situation, that instant of silence revealed more than any denial could. The officiant backed away half a step, instinctively. The groomsmen in the front rows exchanged looks, and on the right side of the hall, Isabella noticed, without looking directly, that the figure in the dark blue suit had moved slightly toward the side exit. "Isabella." Eduardo's voice returned, more controlled now, with the tone he used when he needed to regain ground. "This recording has no context. You are—" "I'm giving context," she said, with absolute serenity. "That is exactly what I'm doing." And so, before the hall that had been prepared to celebrate an alliance, Isabella Cavalcante began to tell, not with anger, not with tears, but with the precision of a strategic director presenting data to a board, every word carefully placed, every fact supported by what had been discovered in those last hours, and every pause calculated to let the silence do the work that words didn't need to do alone. The hall listened, and Eduardo, for the first time since Isabella had known him, had nowhere to hide. What Isabella told the hall was not an accusation, it was an exposition. There was a fundamental difference between the two things that she had learned working alongside her father. An accusation demands immediate defense and creates a stalemate. An exposition of facts creates clarity, and clarity in that type of situation was irreversible. She started at the beginning. Not from the corridor, not from the recording, but from the legal document. She explained with the precise language she used in board meetings what had been found. The proposal to revise the prenuptial agreement, presented 6 weeks earlier by an external assistant of Eduardo's, without the approval of the group's legal department, the window of participation in assets after 24 months, the specific divisions that would be affected. While she spoke, the hall listened with that quality of silence that only happens when a large group of people recognizes, at the same time, that something significant is occurring. Some of the guests closest to the sector, partners of the group, investors, people who knew the weight of the numbers involved, let slip expressions that Isabella caught in her peripheral vision. Raised eyebrows, exchanged looks, the tightening of faces accustomed to calculating implications quickly. Then she spoke about Antonio Freires, not with judgment, only with facts, who he was, what his specialty was, and why the presence of a lawyer with his profile at that event, without appearing on any guest list, constituted a question that needed to be answered. Eduardo remained standing beside her. She had consciously maintained that position, not because she needed the proximity, but because the distance he could create by moving away would be read by the hall as a retreat. He knew that too. That's why he stood still, his expression progressively more controlled, more closed, like someone evaluating in real time what exits still existed. When she reached the point of the call in the corridor, "A few more months, my love," she played the recording snippet again, this time framed by the context of the document and Freire's presence. And what had seemed ambiguous in isolation became transparent within the chain of evidence. The murmur that swept the hall this time was different. It was no longer surprise. It was the sound of a conclusion being reached collectively. Eduardo moved. He took half a step forward, a gesture that could be read as an attempt to intervene, and said, with a firm voice and the tone he used when he wanted to seem reasonable while regaining control, "What you are doing is a series of interpretations presented as facts. Nothing you have shown proves any intention on my part." Isabella looked at him. "You are right," she said, with a tranquility that clearly surprised him. "That is why I am not stating intention. I am presenting evidence." She paused. "And I am asking a simple question, in front of everyone who matters to you and to me. Why did you present a revision of the prenuptial agreement without informing me?" Silence. "Why is Antonio Freires in this hall today, without an invitation, on the day of our wedding?" More silence. "And who were you talking to in that corridor when you said 'a few more months, my love'?" The last question landed on the hall with the weight of something irreversible. There was no way to recontextualize it. There was no way to make it reasonable. And Eduardo, who had spent 18 months building a performance that seemed solid enough to last indefinitely, remained silent long enough for that silence to answer for him. It was Helio Cavalcante who stood up from the first row, without haste, without drama, with the upright posture and measured step of someone who had made difficult decisions in much more adverse conditions. He walked to the center aisle, stopped beside his daughter, and turned to Eduardo with an expression that was not anger. It was closure. "Rodrigo," Helio said, without raising his voice. Rodrigo Sampaio, who had discreetly entered the hall a few minutes before and was positioned at the back, walked to the center with the briefcase in hand. He took out a sheet and handed it to Helio, who held it without looking at it, because he already knew what it contained. "Antonio Freires," Helio said, turning briefly to the side where the man in the dark blue suit had been, "is registered as the legal representative of a company called Mi Gestão de Ativos, incorporated 22 months ago." He paused. "The majority partner of this company is Eduardo Meireles." The name of that company was unknown to most present, but what Helio said next was not. Mi Gestão de Ativos presented 4 months ago a confidential proposal for the partial acquisition of 2 divisions of the Cavalcante Group, the same divisions mentioned in the revision of the prenuptial agreement. The proposal was rejected by our board without reaching my knowledge because it was moving through internal channels of preliminary evaluation. He looked at Eduardo. "Channels that you had mapped during 18 months of access to our corporate environment. The hall made no noise. It was the kind of silence that precedes full understanding, the second before a final piece clicks into place and the complete picture reveals itself. Eduardo opened his mouth, and this time, when he spoke, his voice had a different quality. Not that of the man regaining ground, but that of the man who realizes there is no more ground to regain. Helio, you are interpreting a coincidence as— I am not given to interpretations, Helio said, with the same calmness with which he would have closed a board meeting. I am given to facts, and the facts say that you created a company to acquire assets from our group, tried to modify a legal contract without the knowledge of the interested party, and maintained an 18-month relationship with my daughter, while doing so. He took a final pause. That is not an interpretation. It is a timeline. Isabella looked at Eduardo once more. Then she looked at the ring on her left finger, and with a simple gesture, without ceremony, she removed it and placed it on the flower table beside the central aisle. The golden metal rested on the white cloth like a finished sentence. Fernanda, who had entered the hall during Isabella's speech and remained discreet at the back, observed everything with an expression that combined admiration and relief. She had known Isabella since they were 6, had witnessed every phase of her friend's life, the achievements, the losses, the moments when the weight of the surname seemed greater than anyone should carry. And never, in any of those moments, had she seen Isabella so completely herself as now. Standing in the center of that immense hall without tears, without theatricality, only with the precise clarity of someone who had decided not to be reduced. Eduardo remained standing. Around him, the space had changed quality, not because anyone had moved, but because the position he had occupied for 18 months, the position of someone who controlled the variables, had ceased to exist. He was in the center of a hall full of people who now knew what he had tried to do, and he knew, with the intelligence that had been his main tool until that moment, that there was exactly one path ahead. Without saying anything else, Eduardo Mireles turned and walked toward the exit. The guests made way. No one stopped him, and when the side doors of the hall closed behind him, Isabella stood in the central aisle, surrounded by white flowers and golden light, with the ring on the table and the weight of an illusion that had completely dissolved, to give way to something she still didn't know how to name, but which she recognized as true. The days that followed the wedding that didn't happen had a strange quality. Not the chaos Isabella had vaguely anticipated, but a kind of heightened clarity, as if the air around her had become more transparent after a storm that lasted less than expected. She returned to São Paulo the next morning. The apartment in Itaim Bibi, which she had chosen alone and decorated with the same attention she put into any project, welcomed her with its usual familiar silence. Isabella stood at the entrance for a moment, observing the space that had been entirely hers before Eduardo, and that now became so again, with the difference that now she knew exactly what that return meant. Rodrigo had assembled a legal team still in Goiânia, even before the group returned to São Paulo. Mi Gestão de Ativos, Eduardo's company, would be formally notified about the unauthorized attempt to modify the prenuptial agreement, which in itself created a series of legal implications for the investment boutique Eduardo managed. The acquisition proposal that had circulated internally in the group would be documented and filed as evidence of improper access to confidential information used during the period of the relationship. None of this was simple, but it was, as Rodrigo had said calmly in the meeting they had at the hotel in Goiânia on the night of the event, completely manageable. What Isabella had not anticipated was the reaction of the market. The news had not left the ceremony in complete detail. The people present were, for the most part, professionals accustomed to discerning what is spoken and what is kept in silence. But in the corridors of the agribusiness sector and the financial market, where information travels in circuits that bypass the formal press, what had happened at the Palacio dos Sonhos became known in a specific way. The Cavalcanti group had identified and neutralized a corporate infiltration attempt disguised as a personal relationship, and the person who had done it was Isabella. In the 3 days following the event, she received messages from group partners, from international partners, from people she had greeted at fairs and conferences over the years. Most were brief, direct messages, the type of communication people in the sector make when they want to say something without needing to elaborate. The content varied in form, but converged in a single direction: respect. Halio called her on the afternoon of the second day, not to discuss strategy or legal measures. Rodrigo was taking care of that. He called only to ask how she was. "I'm fine," she said. And this time, unlike what she had answered to Fernanda that morning in the preparation room, it was true. "You know," Halio said after a brief silence, "that what you did there was not just protecting the group. I know. It was also protecting yourself, which is more important." Isabella was silent for a moment. Her father rarely said things directly. It was a habit of someone who had learned to communicate through actions. Therefore, when he chose words, they had specific weight. "I know that too," she said. "Good," Halio said. And he ended the call as he always ended conversations that had already said everything they needed to say. Fernanda arrived at the apartment on the afternoon of the third day, with 2 tubs of ice cream and the willingness to stay as long as necessary. She entered, placed the tubs on the kitchen counter, looked at Isabella, who was sitting in the armchair with a report in hand, and said, "You are not going to pretend you're working while I'm here." "I am working." "You are pretending you're working so you don't have to talk about what happened." Isabella placed the report on the table. Fernanda opened the ice cream tubs, got 2 spoons and settled on the sofa with the naturalness of 26 years of friendship. "How are you really?" Fernanda asked. Isabella thought about the question with the honesty she reserved for very few people. "I'm processing," she said finally. "Not the betrayal itself. I already understood what that was. What I'm processing is how I didn't see it before. Because you trusted, because I chose not to use the tools I have in a context where I thought I didn't need them." She looked at her friend. "And that wasn't naivety. It was a choice. I decided that loving someone meant not analyzing them. That's what most people do." "I am not most people," Isabella said without arrogance, with the same objectivity with which she would identify any variable in a risk analysis. "And that difference should have protected me, but I voluntarily deactivated it." She paused. "That is what I'm processing." Fernanda ate a spoonful of ice cream and was silent for a moment. The type of silence she knew how to do, which didn't pressure and didn't fill the space with unnecessary consolation. "You know what I think," she said later, "that you didn't deactivate anything. You just directed your attention elsewhere because you wanted to believe. And wanting to believe is not a weakness. It's what makes people human." Isabella looked at her. "You're being philosophical." "I'm being your friend." Fernanda pushed the second tub of ice cream toward her. "Eat, and then tell me what comes next." Isabella took the spoon, and for the first time in several days, she felt something that wasn't just clarity or determination. She felt the weight lift slightly, as if the space that the illusion had occupied was beginning, slowly, to open up for something else. She didn't yet know what that something else was, but she knew, with the same certainty with which she had recognized every sign in that marble corridor, that she was going to find out. That night, after Fernanda left, Isabella sat at the apartment window looking at the city of São Paulo, spreading out below with its constant and indifferent luminosity. There was something comforting in that indifference. The city didn't know what had happened. It wasn't processing, it wasn't divided between judgments. It just continued, as it always does, with the speed of something that has millions of stories happening simultaneously and space for all of them. She thought about Eduardo. Not with anger. Anger was an emotion she recognized as too expensive to sustain for a long time. She thought about him with the clinical attention of someone who wants to understand a variable that had been misunderstood. He was intelligent. He had planned every stage carefully, and he had made one mistake that compromised everything. He had underestimated that she might hear him. He had bet that the corridor would be empty, that the day would consume her completely, that the bride would be so absorbed in the ceremony that there would be no room for anything beyond that. He had bet on the wrong thing. Isabella placed her hand on the cold glass of the window and stayed like that for a moment, feeling the temperature of the city reach her through her fingers. Then she stood up, went to her work desk, opened her computer, and began to draft the memorandum she would send to the group's board the next morning. Not about what had happened, but about what needed to be revised in the protocols for access to strategic information and in the analysis processes of internal legal agreements. Because that was who Isabella Cavalcante was. She processed pain and transformed it into structure. Not because she was cold, but because she knew that the best way not to be hit again by the same vulnerability was to understand it completely and seal it carefully. And as she typed, she felt the weight she had carried since that morning in the preparation room finally, truly diminishing. 3 weeks after the wedding that didn't happen, the Cavalcante group published an internal statement announcing the creation of a new security protocol for legal agreements involving members of the controlling family. The document, drafted by Rodrigo Sampaio with direct review by Isabella, established layers of verification that didn't exist before, not because the group was negligent, but because no one had anticipated that that type of vulnerability could be exploited in that way. Eduardo Meirelles' boutique, in turn, began to lose clients with the discreet speed that the market uses when it wants to distance itself from something without creating noise. No public statement was necessary. In the sector where Eduardo operated, reputation was the most valuable currency, and his had changed in value in the most efficient way possible, through the silent judgment of people who knew enough. Mi Gestão de Ativos received the group's legal notification and chose, through Antonio Freires, not to respond within the legal deadline, which, as Rodrigo explained in a meeting, was legally equivalent to a termination of any future claim over the assets mentioned in the unauthorized proposal. Eduardo did not contact Isabella. She had not expected him to. What she had not expected was the call she received in the 4th week from a woman named Camila Souza, who had worked as a senior analyst at Eduardo's boutique for 2 years before resigning 5 months ago. Camila's voice was calm, direct, and she went to the point without ceremony. "I needed to talk to someone from the Cavalcante group, and I thought you were the right person." Isabella was in the office when she answered. She closed the door, sat down, and said, "I'm listening." What Camila told lasted 42 minutes. Isabella took notes on a pad next to the keyboard, with the small and organized handwriting she used when she needed to structure information quickly. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask questions until the end. She just listened. Camila had worked directly with Eduardo on the development of the strategy involving the Cavalcante group. She had participated in the financial analyses of Mi Gestão de Ativos, the value projections for the processing divisions in Mato Grosso and Bahia, and the meetings where Eduardo had drawn the script, the relationship with Isabella, the building of credibility within the group's family environment, the gradual revision of contractual terms, and the planned dissolution after 2 years, with guaranteed participation in the most valuable assets. She had resigned when she understood, during an internal meeting, that what was being built was not a legitimate acquisition, but a maneuver that depended on systematically and prolonged deceiving a specific person. "Why didn't you go to someone before?" Isabella asked when Camila finished. "Because I wasn't sure what would be done with the information, and because I was afraid no one would believe me." A pause. "I saw what happened in Goiânia. I saw how you handled it. Then I understood I could call." Isabella was silent for a moment. There was something in that account she needed to process before any response, not just the information, but what it confirmed. Every detail Camila described fit with precision into what she had discovered in those frantic hours before the ceremony. But there was a difference between suspecting that something was built against you and hearing someone who was in the room where it was planned confirm it with names, dates, and stages. It was different, not destructive. She had already processed the betrayal in the previous weeks, but it was different in a way that required her to take a deep breath before continuing. "Would you be willing to formalize this?" Isabella asked. "In a deposition for our legal department?" "Yes, that's why I called." Isabella closed the pad, looked at the office window facing the avenue below, and stayed like that for a moment. The afternoon sun came through the glass and created a rectangle of light on the desk she had occupied for 5 years, the same desk where she had read contracts, prepared presentations, made decisions that impacted hundreds of people. a desk she knew very well and that at that moment seemed simultaneously familiar and new. "Rodrigo will contact you later today to organize everything," she said. "And Camilla, thank you for calling." "Thank you for doing what you did there," Camilla said simply. Isabella hung up. She stood motionless for a few seconds. Then she opened her computer, searched for Rodrigo's contact, and began to type. There was work to do, and she was, above all, good at what she did. In the following weeks, Camilla's testimony fueled the legal case the group carefully assembled, not to destroy Eduardo publicly, but to ensure that every door he had tried to open remained definitively closed. Freires withdrew from representation. The boutique entered an internal restructuring process, and Eduardo Meirelles' name, which had circulated for 18 months as the Cavalcante Fiancé, began to circulate in another way, with that kind of discreet reservation that in the market means more than any formal declaration. Isabella did not follow this process with satisfaction. She followed it with the professional attention of someone who needs to ensure that a vulnerability has been completely sealed. The difference between the two things was, for her, absolute. At the end of the 5th week, Rodrigo entered her office with a final report and an expression she recognized as contained satisfaction. "It's over," he said. Isabella took the report, scanned the pages with her eyes, and closed it. "Good work, Rodrigo." He nodded and headed toward the door. Before leaving, he turned around. "One thing, Isabella. What you did in that hall, the way you handled everything, without losing your composure, with the right evidence at the right time, was not just effective." He looked at her. It was admirable. She let him go without answering, but after the door closed, she stared at the report for a moment and allowed briefly Rodrigo's observation to find some space within her before returning to work. That same afternoon, Helio Cavalcante called a meeting with the group's directors, not to discuss what had occurred, which had already been sufficiently documented, but to announce a structural change that had been designed in the last few weeks with Isabella's direct participation. Starting that month, Isabella would formally assume the position of Executive Director of Strategic Operations, a position that combined the responsibilities she already exercised with formal authority over the expansion processes of the Mato Grosso and Bahia divisions. It was the position that should have existed for years and that had been postponed for a series of reasons that no one needed to name anymore. Helio made the announcement with his characteristic brevity. The directors present reacted with the same sobriety, because none of them needed an explanation as to why Isabella Cavalcante deserved to be where she was being placed. After the meeting, when the room had emptied, Helio sat at the head of the table, and Isabella approached. He looked at her the same way he had in the preparation room that morning in Goiânia, with that fraction of a second more that said everything he didn't need to put into words. "You know this should have happened sooner," he said. "I know," she agreed. "I'm not going to apologize for the delays that were mine." "You don't need to." Isabella placed her hand on her father's shoulder for a moment, a rare gesture between the two, which for that very reason had specific weight. "We are here now." Helio nodded, and there was on his face, for a brief instant, something she recognized as relief. The relief of someone who had seen a potentially devastating situation transform, through the competence and courage of someone he loved, into something that strengthened what was supposed to have remained intact. Isabella left the meeting room with her usual step, firm, direct, without unnecessary haste, but with something different in her shoulders, not lighter exactly, more whole, as if the space that had been occupied by illusion and then by the resolution process had finally established itself as something that truly belonged to her. 2 months after the wedding that didn't happen, the Cavalcante Group held its first major public presentation under the new leadership structure. The event was organized for a select group of strategic partners and international investors, a working dinner at the roof garden of Hotel Unique in São Paulo, with the city view as a backdrop for what was, essentially, a declaration of continuity and direction. Isabella had prepared the presentation personally, not because she didn't have a team for it, she did, but because there was something in that specific moment that demanded the words be hers, that the numbers be reviewed by her, that each slide reflect a vision she had built over years and that now had for the first time an adequate stage. She entered the room with the same step she used in any meeting, direct, without hesitation, with the posture of someone who is exactly where they should be. The group present was composed of people she had known for years in different capacities, partners who had followed the group's trajectory, investors who had calibrated their trust based on Helio's decisions, and some new faces arriving with specific interest in what the group was building for the future. Helio sat to the right, as he always did, present but in the background. Fernanda had appeared at the beginning of the evening just to wish luck and confirm her friend was well. "You look great," she said, and there was a precision in that which went beyond the standard compliment. And Rodrigo was at the back, with his usual briefcase, ready for any legal question that arose. Isabella began the presentation. She spoke about the last quarter's numbers, about the expansion of the processing divisions in Mato Grosso and Bahia, the same divisions that had been the target of Eduardo's strategy, and which were now projected to grow 42% in the next 18 months under the new management protocol she had designed. She spoke about the international contracts being renegotiated with better conditions. She spoke about the structural adjustments the group had implemented to strengthen its internal governance. At no point did she mention what had happened in Goiânia, not because it was taboo, it was a fact known to everyone present, but because it had reached the point where that event was, for her, part of the group's timeline, not the center of it. It had happened. It had been resolved. And what was being presented there was what came next. When she finished, the silence lasted 2 or 3 seconds, the kind that precedes a genuine reaction, not a protocol one. And then came the applause. Not the polite applause of someone fulfilling a social convention, but what happens when a room of intelligent people recognizes they have just heard something substantial. One of the international investors, a Swede named Lars Holmberg, who had worked with the group for 11 years without ever establishing a closer bond with Isabella than formal greetings at events, stood up during the Q&A session and said, "I have followed the Cavalcante group for more than a decade, and what I heard today tells me that the next decade will be more interesting than the last." He looked at her directly. "Congratulations, Director." Isabella thanked him with the same economy of words she had inherited from her father. But as the conversations dispersed among the groups around the tables, she stood for a moment by the window looking at the city, the same city she had looked at from her apartment window on the processing nights of the previous weeks, and allowed the moment to settle. It wasn't the destination. She knew that. The work ahead of her was extensive, complex, and would demand from her the same things it always had: attention, discipline, the ability to navigate uncertainty with a cool head. But it was a real turning point, the kind of moment that, looked at from the inside, might seem small, but which she recognized, with the same clarity with which she had recognized every signal in that marble corridor, as something that would change the axis of things from then on. Fernanda appeared beside her, holding a glass of sparkling water she had captured from one of the circulating waiters. "How are you?" she asked, with her usual tone, direct, without embellishment. "Fine," Isabella said, and this time, as it had been since that processing night in São Paulo, the word was completely true. "I know." Fernanda lightly touched her friend's shoulder. "You were great up there. I was prepared." "You always are." Fernanda looked at her sideways, but today was different. You could feel it. Isabella didn't answer immediately. She looked at the city spreading below the window with its usual luminosity, indifferent, continuous, full of stories happening at the same time, and she thought briefly of that preparation room in Goiânia, of the bouquet of orchids on the armchair, the dress in the mirror, the silence that had settled when she heard that phrase for the first time. "A few more months, my love." That phrase had been the beginning of everything, of the discovery, the process, the chain of decisions that had led her there. And there was also a level where the phrase had been true, just not in the way Eduardo had imagined. A few more months had been necessary, months to resolve, to reorganize, to understand, to occupy the space that had been released when the illusion was removed. And now she was here, with the group more solid than it had been before, with a position that reflected who she really was, with an understanding of herself that had come out clearer on the other side of all that. Isabella moved away from the window, slightly adjusted the blazer she was wearing. Navy blue, structured, the choice of someone who knows exactly what they want to communicate, and returned to the center of the room, where guests waited to continue the conversations the presentation had opened. There was work to do, and she was, as always, ready to start. Later that night, after the last guest had left and the team began to collect the presentation materials, Helio stood beside his daughter for a few minutes while they waited for the elevator. They didn't talk business. There was nothing to add to what had been said, presented, and decided in those weeks. Helio looked at her the same way he had in the preparation room, with that fraction of a second more that contained everything he didn't need to put into words. Then he said, with the brevity that was his signature, "Your mother would have been proud." Isabella didn't answer. She didn't need to. She just let those words find their place, inside the part of her that still carried her mother's absence, who had passed away when Isabella was 23, and which she had learned to integrate as part of who she was, not as a gap. The elevator arrived. They went in, and as the doors closed over the view of the illuminated roof garden, Isabella looked at the reflection of the two of them in the metallic mirror of the cabin, the daughter and the father, standing side by side with the posture they both carried, the same firmness in the shoulders, the same brown eyes that had seen difficult things and continued. She had lost a wedding. She had lost a belief she had carefully nurtured for 18 months. She had gone through days of silent processing, of meticulous legal work, of conversations that cost effort even when they were necessary. And she had arrived here, with the group stronger, with the position she deserved, with the clarity of someone who came out of a difficult situation understanding more about herself than she knew before entering. The elevator went down, the doors opened, and Isabella Cavalcante stepped out into the São Paulo night, the city that never stopped, that never waited, that always had room for those who were ready for what came next. She was ready. 6 months after that October afternoon in Goiânia, Isabella Cavalcante was sitting on the balcony of the group's central office on the 23rd floor of a building on Faria Lima, with a cup of coffee that had cooled without her noticing. It was an April morning, the sun still low over São Paulo, the city waking up with the noise it had never learned to make any other way. On the table, she had the draft of an international expansion contract, the first the group would sign with a European partner for the distribution of the food processing lines that the Mato Grosso and Bahia divisions had developed in the last 2 years. It was a contract that had taken 11 months to reach that point, which had gone through 3 rounds of negotiation, and which represented the kind of growth that doesn't happen by accident. It happens through sustained work, through clear vision, through a series of decisions made at the right moment. Isabella read the last clause, made a note in the margin with the pen she always carried, and closed the draft. There was a moment, in that marble corridor of the Palacio dos Sonhos, when everything had seemed about to collapse. Not the group. The group was solid, built by decades of work by people who had bet their lives on it, but something she had carefully nurtured, which she had protected from cold analysis because she believed love required that protection. The belief that someone had chosen her for who she was, not for what she represented. That belief had been destroyed in that corridor, and she had learned in the months that followed that the destruction of a false belief is not a loss. It is clarity. Painful sometimes, expensive in terms of energy and time, but clarity in the end. And clarity was the most useful thing a person could have. The cell phone vibrated on the table. It was Fernanda, with a message that simply said, "Dinner today, I have news." I have. Isabella smiled, a genuine smile without effort, the kind that happens when something simple and good appears in the middle of a workday. She typed, "Sounds good," and put the phone back. She looked out the window at the city. There was, in São Paulo, an energy she had always recognized as a sister to her own, an energy that didn't stop, that didn't wait, that found a way to continue, regardless of what had happened the day before. She had grown up in this city with the weight of a surname that demanded things from her, and she had learned over the years to transform that weight into fuel. There was no bitterness in thinking about Eduardo. There was sometimes the question of what kind of person dedicates so much time and intelligence to building something that isn't real. But it was a question she asked with analytical curiosity, not with resentment. Resentment was an expensive choice, and she had learned from an early age to be selective with what she chose to carry. What she carried now was different. Not lighter, exactly. There was enough work on that table to ensure that lightness would never be the correct word to describe her days. But more whole. As if the space the illusion had occupied had transformed slowly into space for things that were truly hers. The European contract, the position that reflected what she really was within the group, the conversation with Helio in the elevator, those words about her mother that still resonated with a frequency she didn't try to translate, the friendship with Fernanda that had survived 26 years of life and that had been, on that day in Goiânia, exactly what it needed to be. They were real things. And real things, she knew now better than before, had a weight different from everything built on false premises. Isabella stood up from the table, walked to the window and stood before it for a moment. The city was there as always, indifferent, continuous, full of stories. She was one of those stories, one that had gone through a turning point and come out the other side with more clarity than she had entered. It wasn't an end. It was a starting point, the kind that is only recognized as such after enough of the path has already been traveled to look back and see where one came from. She returned to the table, opened the draft of the contract again and began to work. Dear listeners, the story of Isabella Cavalcante reminds us that the most difficult moments sometimes arrive dressed in ceremony, flowers, and promises that seem solid, and that what we do when the veil falls reveals who we really are. Isabella did not run. She did not collapse. She used everything she had, intelligence, courage, trust in the right people, and transformed a betrayal into clarity. If this story reached you with some weight, with some recognition, with the feeling that you have already felt something like this, then it did what it was supposed to do. And there are many more stories like this waiting for you here on our channel. Subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Leave your like if this narrative touched you in some way. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Isabella's place? Would you have walked to the altar, knowing what she knew? The next story is already on its way, and we promise it will surprise you as much as this one. Until then. End of story.